This is a season of profound upheaval for the royal family. King Charles had steeled himself for hard choices, family fractures, and the prospect of isolation. Nothing, however, prepared him for the sealed decree laid before him that morning. Issued under the late Queen's authority, it contained a single crushing directive. Camilla was barred from permanent residence in every royal home under Crown control. As Charles reached the final line, his hand froze and the study fell into absolute silence. Before we examine what this truly means for the monarchy, subscribe so you never miss an update. A royal secretary entered the Buckingham Palace study carrying a red dispatch box marked with Elizabeth's cipher, the official emblem that identified documents issued in her name. He placed it before the king and explained that the seal could be broken only after constitutional review, confirming whether the instructions retained force after a sovereign's death. Charles opened the box, unaware that the pages inside would strike at the heart of his marriage. The decree listed every residence: Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham House, Balmoral Castle, and all other crown-controlled properties were closed to Camilla as permanent homes. These estates belonged to the monarchy itself, not to the reigning sovereign as private property. Charles read the restriction twice, removed his glasses, and set them beside the paper. His devastation ran deeper than the order alone. His mother had written it knowing her son would one day learn how little power his love could exert. Camilla waited nearby, expecting a discussion of future household arrangements. When the king entered without the folder, she studied his face and understood at once that something irreversible had occurred. She asked what had been decided. He tried to speak, but the words refused to form. A handwritten clause made the decree still more severe. No sovereign could overturn it privately. Any challenge required a formal crown council, and the outcome would enter the permanent record. Charles asked who else knew. The secretary replied that Princess Anne and Prince William had been named custodians, charged with protecting the document and ensuring its instructions were obeyed. Before Charles could tell the Queen Consort everything, Anne arrived and asked to see her brother alone. She carried a second sealed envelope written in their mother's hand. Charles realized the decree had revealed only part of the truth. It had not merely separated Camilla from the royal residences. It had placed him between the woman he loved and the family members sworn to uphold his mother's final command. For Charles, this was never simply a dispute over rooms or keys. The decree struck at the private future he believed he had finally secured after decades of scrutiny. For Camilla, the order carried a colder meaning still. She could stand beside the king in public, yet the late queen had ensured that the oldest royal walls would never fully accept her as belonging within them. Charles carried memories through every corridor. Windsor held the weight of his childhood and the long years when succession felt more burden than promise. Balmoral held quieter summers, difficult conversations, and the lingering authority of a mother whose reach extended beyond death. These were not merely grand houses. They were the places where the monarch's identity had been formed, which made the decree feel like a personal judgment written into the stones themselves. Camilla understood that her position had always rested on more than a title. The Queen Consort was the wife of the reigning monarch, yet that title conferred neither ownership nor permanent rights over royal property. Her acceptance had been gradual, shielded by Charles's loyalty and the institution's slow approval. With a single document, that protection suddenly seemed fragile. In the private sitting room, she looked directly at him. "Which houses?" she asked. Charles could not answer at once. He moved to the window, collected himself, and named them slowly: Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham, Balmoral. Each name fell like a separate loss. She remained still until the final residence had been spoken, and he saw that she already understood. This was no temporary measure. It was a permanent boundary. Camilla did not weep. She reached into her handbag, took out a palace key, and placed it on the table between them. Then she asked whether the others must be surrendered before nightfall. The practical, restrained question broke something in Charles far more painfully than anger could have done. Anne viewed the decree differently. The Princess Royal believed it protected crown property from personal loyalty, inheritance disputes, and competing claims after her brother's reign. In her mind, the order was not punishment, but a necessary barrier against confusion. William felt no such certainty. In a private conversation with Catherine, He admitted that enforcing the document could destroy his father emotionally, yet he also feared that ignoring his grandmother's command would fracture trust in the crown, the institution that separates family wishes from national duty. Catherine then noticed a brief handwritten note attached to the decree. It referred to the Windsor incident as the moment that made the restriction necessary. To understand why Elizabeth had taken so extraordinary a step, the family would have to confront the private evening at Windsor they had spent years refusing to name. The decree was not born of distant suspicion. It began during one closed evening at Windsor Castle when an ordinary conversation became the point of no return. Only 4 people were present. No minutes were taken. By sunrise, the late Queen had summoned her private secretary and begun drafting the order that would one day devastate her eldest son. Queen Elizabeth had invited Charles, Camilla and Anne into her private drawing room after a family memorial service. Grief still hung in the air. None expected a practical discussion to become a permanent fracture. The monarch wanted clarity about the fate of royal residences after her death. Crown properties were held for the institution, not personal estates a king or queen could freely pass to a spouse. Camilla listened carefully before asking the question that changed the room. She wanted to know whether she would retain a permanent private suite at Windsor and continued access to Balmoral if she survived her husband. The Queen's expression hardened at once. To her, the request did not sound like security. It sounded like a claim stretching beyond Charles's lifetime into the next reign. Charles moved quickly to defend his wife, arguing that denying her long-term protection would humiliate her and reopen wounds the family had spent years trying to close. He believed he was defending dignity. Elizabeth heard an attempt to turn personal suffering into permanent entitlement. Anne watched the argument deepen. The Princess Royal had expected careful discussion, but she saw her mother's tone change when loyalty and property became entangled. Then came the decisive moment. Camilla placed a proposed household memorandum on the table, a formal written plan listing Windsor, Balmoral and other residences for her continued personal use. Elizabeth read the page, closed it without signing, and pushed it back. She said the Crown's homes could never become compensation for past suffering. The meeting ended without agreement, but the damage was already done. Later that night, the Queen instructed her private secretary to prepare a binding decree blocking Camilla from permanent residency in Crown-controlled properties. Anne witnessed the order. William was later named a future custodian. Now, Anne held the second envelope containing their mother's private explanation to Charles. When Anne finally placed the letter before him, the buried argument at Windsor was no longer history. It became a confrontation between the living. Charles dismissed every aid. No courtiers remained to soften the language. The king demanded to know why his sister had guarded the decree in silence. Anne answered with equal force. She had not guarded it from him. She had guarded their mother's final authority from everyone, including him. They sat opposite each other in a small private chamber, with the decree between them and the late Queen's letter still unopened. Charles accused his sister of standing beside him at ceremonies while knowing his marriage would one day face this humiliation. Anne's voice tightened. Loyalty, she said, did not mean disobeying a sovereign. Then her control slipped. She admitted that carrying the secret had cost her years of closeness with Charles. Anne opened the letter and read from Elizabeth's own hand. The Queen wrote that she never doubted her son's love for Camilla. What she feared was his devotion blurring the line between the Crown's inheritance and his wife's private future. Royal homes, she insisted, could not become proof of affection. Then came the deeper wound. Elizabeth had expected Charles to challenge the decree. She had required William's involvement because only the future king, she believed, could stop the current monarch from acting through grief. The decision had been designed not only to resist Camilla's claim, but to resist Charles himself. The king rose and declared he would summon the Crown Council to overturn the restriction. That would force William to choose between his father and his grandmother's final command. The conflict had escaped the private room. The next decision would not belong to Charles alone. William entered the council chamber, knowing a single decision could define both his relationship with his father and the kind of king he would one day become. Charles expected loyalty, Anne expected duty, Camilla expected mercy. Yet the late Queen had designed the decree so that William's consent was essential, placing the future monarch at the center of a wound no title could protect him from. Outside the chamber, Catherine found him with their grandmother's note clenched in his hand. She asked one quiet question: was he deciding as a son or as an heir? William admitted he no longer knew where one duty ended and the other began. Inside, Charles appealed at once. The decree, he argued, punished Camilla simply for surviving him and condemned her to become a royal widow without a royal home. William answered without emotion. He revealed that Camilla would not be left homeless. She could retain privately owned residences and receive financial provision. What she could not hold was permanent control over homes belonging to the crown. He also disclosed the safeguard Elizabeth had buried inside the order. Any attempt to transfer a royal residence into private ownership would trigger automatic review by trustees and the government. Anne watched her nephew carefully. The decision had shifted from family loyalty to institutional survival. William refused immediate consent. Instead, he requested one final private conversation with Camilla. Her answer, he said, would decide whether the family entered an open constitutional struggle. The consequences began before any final agreement. By late afternoon, household staff received instructions to suspend Camilla's residential privileges. A leather case was placed before her, and one by one, the keys to the royal homes were requested back. She could still attend official functions and stay temporarily beside Charles, but permanent rooms, independent access, and authority over staff were gone. Staff moved through her suites at Windsor, Buckingham Palace, Sandringham, and Balmoral, separating personal belongings from the royal collection. When Balmoral's key was called, she hesitated, then placed it in the case without protest. Charles entered, ordered the officials to leave, and apologized. Camilla answered quietly that his apology could not change the most painful truth. His mother had prepared for this day long before either of them knew it was coming. Another blow followed. Several rooms she believed had been prepared for her long-term use had never been formally assigned. Elizabeth had kept them under temporary designation for years. Charles received notice that his emergency request could not proceed unless William signed the authorization before midnight. Without that approval, the decree would become administratively permanent. Camilla did not ask him to fight harder. She requested a private meeting with William before the deadline. Charles realized she had already reached a decision neither man expected. They met in a modest room at Clarence House. No secretaries, no advisors, no red boxes. William placed the unsigned authorization on the table and told her that Charles viewed refusal as betrayal. Camilla admitted that surrendering the keys had felt like the final judgment on her entire life. Every locked door seemed to say that years of service and public acceptance had remained conditional. William acknowledged the cruelty of the order, yet explained his fear. If he overturned his grandmother's command simply because Charles loved his wife, that act could become a precedent, placing private desire above crown property. Then Camilla stunned him. She asked him not to sign. She would not allow Charles to damage his bond with his son or weaken the monarchy merely to prove devotion. She offered a signed renunciation. She would live permanently at Ray Mill House, use Clarence House only where legally permitted, surrender every claim to crown property, continue her public duties, and never challenge ownership or succession arrangements. William read the document twice. He had expected pressure and found sacrifice. When he returned to Buckingham Palace, the authorization remained unsigned, but Camilla's renunciation rested in his hand. Charles had spent the day preparing to defeat his mother's decree, only to discover that Camilla herself had decided to let it stand. By sunrise, the secret could no longer be contained. The palace released a carefully worded statement confirming new residential arrangements for the Queen Consort. Within minutes, broadcasters interrupted programming, newspapers changed their front pages, and crowds gathered outside the gates. What had begun as a private family decree was now interpreted as a public verdict on love, legitimacy, and the limits of a king's power. Charles watched the first bulletin alone as a presenter described him as a king overruled by his mother's final command. Camilla watched footage of staff vehicles leaving Windsor with labeled cases from her former suite, then instructed her secretary not to issue any defensive statement. Her silence was deliberate. Outside Buckingham Palace, one woman placed a handwritten card against the gates. "The crown belongs to history, but grief belongs to people." The words became the defining symbol of public reaction. William understood that silence could no longer protect anyone. With the nation divided, Charles faced one final choice: challenge the decree and deepen the wound, or accept it and transform humiliation into duty. He returned to the study where the decree had first been opened. On the desk lay 3 documents: his mother's command, Camilla's renunciation, and the unused authorization. He summoned Anne, William, and Camilla for one last private meeting. No officials, no advisors. They met as a family determined to end the conflict before public humiliation hardened into permanent bitterness. Charles looked at each of them and accepted that Elizabeth's decree would remain fully in force. Camilla would hold no permanent residential rights in any crown-controlled home. He turned to Anne and admitted that his anger had come from feeling judged by their mother even after her death. The Princess Royal answered that Elizabeth had not condemned his marriage. She had protected a boundary she believed no sovereign should erase. Charles reached for Camilla's hand and apologized for becoming so determined to defend her that he had stopped listening to what she had chosen. She told him a home secured through conflict with his son, his sister, and his mother's final command would never have felt like home. Her sacrifice was not surrender. It was the only decision that allowed her to leave with dignity. William lifted the unused authorization and tore it in half. He would preserve the decree, yet honor the fact that Camilla had accepted its terms voluntarily. Charles signed a personal statement separating crown property from private family provision and arranged secure independent accommodation for his wife without transferring royal assets. The monarch remained devastated, but the decree did not destroy his marriage. It taught him the hardest truth of kingship: power can protect love, yet it cannot make every private wish legitimate. In the end, the closed doors did not prove that Camilla had never belonged. They proved that even love beside a throne must stop where the crown's duty begins. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.